On the eve of the Women's Day and our attempt to contribute to women breaking the glass ceiling, some of them already are doing that in a kick-ass fashion. It's an absolute delight to talk to Pranjul Bhandari of HSBC. And amongst other things that we'll discuss with her, her note has some very interesting thoughts around how can India escape the lower growth and ascend to higher growth, especially in light of the fact that there is a tariff-driven period that is upon all of us, which might impact near-term growth prospects, if you will. Pranjul, great having you. Thank you so much for taking the time out, and in advance, a happy Women's Day to you.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The pleasure is entirely ours. Pranjul, just before we get to some of the things that you've written on the note as well, any thoughts that you have which you can share around this whole negotiations and renegotiations and tariffs and rollbacks and what impact it has and potentially could have on global growth and India growth?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's a period of heightened uncertainty, right? Every asset class is reacting. Every day you wake up in the morning and you just don't know what you're going to see in your screens. And I think this is something that's going to continue. What happens when there's so much of uncertainty? Generally, more long-term growth drivers like investments take a backseat. In periods like this, we see the FDI pot shrink. After all, which company would want to put in more capacity when you don't know where things will land once the dust settles, right? So generally, this is a period of low investment, which sort of hurts your potential growth. And generally, because there's so much more protectionism in the system, it could also be a period of lesser trade flows. So for both these reasons, lower investment, lesser trade flows around the world, we could see global growth actually come off. And every country will get impacted, some directly, some indirectly, and India will as well.
Pranjul, hi, great to speak with you as always. And I was just going through your note, and what I found interesting is when you talk about the Indian perspective and these US tariffs being a catalyst for India. Break that down, because when I hear Donald Trump speaking at pretty much every speech, every conference, he's talking about India in the context of tariffs. But when you look at the data, there's not that much high value, high tariff trade between the two nations, isn't it?
Yeah, look, you're right. Let's put it this way, that India has one of the highest tariff differentials with the US. India generally is a very high import tariff economy, and it has been for the last decade. It's almost like we didn't notice it, but now that President Trump is talking about it, everybody's really sitting up to it right now. The truth is we've had this for the last decade. I don't want to underestimate the pain if new tariffs are imposed on India. Like, for example, if we see reciprocal tariffs imposed by the US on India, my back of the envelope calculation suggests that several sectors will get impacted, and overall GDP growth in India could fall by about 0.3 percentage points. That's not an insignificant number. So there's definitely short-term pain out there. But, I wanted to take a look wider than just short-term pain. I wanted to see if this is a situation which we can change into our sort of benefit over time. What we know about India in the past is it reforms best in periods of crisis. So can we actually do some reforms which we've not been able to do? And in order to do this, what I do is I look back in history and I look at various episodes. What has made India grow fast and what has hurt India's growth? And interestingly, I find two important sort of periods. One is 2000 to 2010. The other is 2010 to 2020. The former period, India was growing at a very fast clip. Exports growth were at the head of growth. It was growing 13% year on year in real terms. Whereas in the second period, GDP growth actually fell and exports growth actually fell from 13% to 3% year on year. Now, one big difference between these two decades is in the first decade, import tariffs were coming down. So India was not really taxing all the imports it was doing. Whereas in the second decade, India was actually raising import tariffs. So my sense is that raising import tariffs over the last decade has cost India exports and GDP growth. Now, when I sort of look at this, and I like to really compare this India's trajectory to China, And I find something rather interesting, which is that for China to be an exporting powerhouse, it was also importing a lot, particularly in the first 2 decades. So it was importing, adding value to it, and then exporting it. Over time, its requirement to import came off because it became more self-sufficient in making its inputs on its own. But for the longest time, it was importing in order to export. India clamped down on this very quickly. We made importing very expensive by putting all kinds of import tariffs, and as a result, our exports also slowed in this 2010 to 2020 period. So one big lesson for me is that India really needs to cut down on import tariffs. And I think this whole threats of tariffs around the world, that if you don't cut your tariffs, we will impose more on you, is becoming a catalyst for reforms. We are for the first time actually cutting down on tariffs. And I think this will be a great step for us in the long term if we continue to do it.
So just a couple of follow-ups, Pranjul, and I want to start with the short term first. And it's interesting that you've taken a wider view and the virtuous cycle that it may kickstart if we are forced to cut tariffs and forced to make imports cheaper. But I want to understand about the short-term pain. You mentioned that there are sectors which would be hit. You're penciling in at least 0.3% impact on the GDP if reciprocal tariffs come in. What are the key sectors, first of all, which will be impacted?
Okay, look, the truth is we don't know. There is a negotiation going on between India and the US. We don't know that if, firstly, what form this whole reciprocal tariffs will take, whether it will be the same sectors in which India imposes tariffs that US will impose tariffs on India, or will it be different sectors? So the truth is we really don't know. But if you look at the sectors where India has the highest import tariffs compared to the US, and which might be an eyesore for the US, I think the ones that really stand out are agriculture, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, gems and jewelry. These are some of the sectors that sort of top the list. And, we could see some reciprocal action, at least in those sectors. But the truth is we don't know. And that's why rather than speaking at a sector level, until the details come, I'm looking at a more broad macroeconomic level. And that is sort of clearer to say that, the growth impact could be about 0.3 percentage points.
Okay, fair enough. Just on the point of tariffs and the change in tariffs maybe becoming a positive catalyst, are we taking into account the core fundamental reason why tariffs have been high and increasing in India? It's coming from a policy position of encouraging domestic sector, encouraging make in India, and yes, there might be some negotiation and tweaks because of Trump's imposition, but fundamentally there seems to be no reason why we should change and go into a lower tariff regime.
Well, look, the truth is imposing tariffs is a very, very slippery slope. Every time we say that we are going to only impose it in a few industries, which we want to encourage domestically, we start with those few industries, but then we keep imposing them on more and more industries until a point that our entire cost of production becomes very high. And I think this is a problem we faced in the 70s and 80s. And again, this became a problem which we faced in the last 10 years. We started with the best of intentions, but then it became a slippery slope and we just started imposing tariffs on many sectors, quite a lot. And that really generally bought up the cost of production in India. So I think the way to address this is you should really earmark one or two strategic or sensitive sectors where you want industrial capacity to grow domestically, maybe have some import tariffs for that to encourage domestic manufacturing, but just keep it to that, contain it to that. And for everything else, bring down your import tariffs. I think that's how we should proceed, which is something we were not able to do as well in the last couple of years.
Pranjul, lest this become a bit of a tariff conversation, but because it's such an important point, I'm going to ignore some of the other things in the note and ask you a follow-up on this before we wrap up the conversation, so excuse us for that. But the flip side to this point that you're making, or rather the positive side, and kind of corroborating that, one of the thought processes is also this, that innovation will only stem when a sectors have their back to the door, and when competing with really world-class products that are hitherto haven't come but now might come by virtue of lower tariffs. So the point is, higher tariffs eventually are paid for by the consumer, right? In the end, if there is a tariff and there is an higher priced good made in India or from abroad, it is you and me who are paying for it. Does this therefore do the dual purpose of the much needed innovation in a lot of sectors, as well as a better bang for the buck for the consumer at the end?
Look, let me take a step back. Lots of time we feel very happy in countries like India and Indonesia that the domestic demand is very strong. And because of that, our growth will always sort of remain strong. Will not go up and down when global sentiments or global volatility has sort of picked up. The flip side to that is that sometimes you can get very complacent, which I think may have been the case in India over the last decade. You feel like domestically we can do a lot, and therefore you don't make effort to go into the global platform and compete, sell, export in the global platform, because it's the global platform that really puts, very strict sort of quality controls on you and makes you innovate, do better, rise up to the occasion. The kind of story we saw from Korea, for example. Korea started exporting very quickly, and it had a lot of it had high import tariffs, but it also had very strict conditions that you have to export a lot more if you want to continue to enjoy high import tariffs. And that's how Korea really sort of went up ahead. So for us to be more aligned with the world, integrated in terms of import and export, will actually bring up the quality of our producers, and then producers will realize that they need to do more R&D. So I completely agree with you that you need lower tariffs, better integration with the world to increase your own quality cost of production, and then you can also benefit consumers on the back of that. Before we wrap up, I wanted to make another point in the report, which was on FDI. We have been trying to welcome FDI in high-tech sectors, and we've done a good job, like electronics, semiconductors. But through the whole process, we've completely missed out mid-tech FDI. Mid-tech FDI in labor-intensive sectors like footwear, textiles, furniture. In fact, other countries like ASEAN became a beneficiary of that after the Trump 1 episode. We did not. And I think that's another area where we really need to forge ahead, because that's FDI in labor intensive sectors. It can get us both jobs and GDP growth. And the world really is looking for new producers. We all worry about China excess capacity, but China excess capacity is actually not that much in these mid-tech and low-tech sectors. So it's a great opportunity for India to actually land, in that place and start creating more jobs. So if there's two things I think we can do very well for us. Number one, we can cut import tariffs, particularly on important inputs. And number two, we can become far more welcoming of mid-tech FDI, which can become a source of jobs for us. And I think that we've already started seeing the right things in both these fronts. And if we continue to do this, then over the medium term, we may become beneficiaries.
Okay, Pranjul, such an important point, and it's a different light in which a lot of people see this, but I'm glad you're making this point today on the eve of Women's Day, as I said yet again. Thank you, and Tamanna, great to have Pranjul today.
Yeah. I mean, very happy Women's Day to you, Pranjul. And when we say talking about beyond glass ceilings, it's a prime example there. Really, really happy to talk to you.